Next, I want to build a simple drop-down like the kind you might see in a nav bar where maybe you have your avatar and you click on it and a menu pops out where you can go to your account settings or log out, that sort of thing. So like always, I think the best way to get started is to just work on getting the markup in place and then add the styling after the fact. So I've gone ahead and created an account drop-down component here where we're going to actually build this thing. So I've got an empty div here to start, and inside of that, I'm going to start by creating a button, which is what we're actually going to click to open the drop-down menu. And inside of this button, I'm going to add an image where I'm just going to paste in an avatar that I grabbed from Unsplash. And for the alt text, we'll just say your avatar. Now, underneath this button, I'm going to create another div, which is going to hold the contents of the actual drop-down. So for our purposes, maybe we'll just have a couple of links here. Maybe we'll have something like account settings, maybe a way to contact support, and maybe a link for signing out of your account. Okay, so this obviously doesn't look quite right yet, so let's focus on getting the button styled first maybe. So I'm going to add a class attribute to the button, and the first thing that I'm going to do is set it to be display block, because buttons are inline block by default, which means they're affected by line height, and sometimes you get extra pixels that you don't really want to deal with. So since we're sort of designing this in isolation, I don't want any of that stuff lying around. I'm just going to use display block. Next, I want to add some dimensions to this button so we can actually give this button the size that we want it to have. So maybe we'll start with something like H6W6 and see how that looks. Okay, that's way too small, so let's try maybe H8W8. And I think the reason this actually looks a little bit smaller than it should is because we are setting this button to be a square, but the image is intrinsically a rectangle. So I think we actually do have a square here, but we just have some sort of empty space above and below. So why don't we try and fix that? So I'm going to head over to this image. I'm going to add a class here as well. And to start, let's just say HFull WFull so that it fills the whole box. And there you go. Now you can see we have a square, but the image is stretched out. So we can use that trick that we talked about earlier in the course to make sure that we preserve the image's intrinsic aspect ratio without stretching it by setting object fit to cover. And that's going to make sure that the image fills whatever space is necessary without stretching. And all it's doing here is just cropping off the edge of the image instead of doing any weird distorting. Okay, next, I think I want to make this like a circular button since we've been using a lot of rounded corners throughout the project so far. So let's go ahead and try to add some rounded corners to the button. So why don't we try something like rounded full so we get a full circular shape. And you'll see that even though we saved this file, we didn't actually see any change happen over here. Now the reason for that is that this image has square corners, and those square corners are poking outside of the button. So we can hide anything that sort of bleeds out of the area covered by the button by using overflow hidden, saying that anything that, overflows this element should be hidden. Okay, so now we do have a nice circular button here. So to get the details right here, one thing I'm a little bit worried about is the focus state. If we go ahead and tab to this, you can see we just get the sort of default glow focus ring. I think in Chrome and Firefox and stuff, this is usually blue. In Sizzy, which is the app I'm using to preview this stuff, it shows up as orange. Either way, it's ugly. So I think maybe a nicer focus state for this would be like sort of a highlighting circular border or something. Now I don't want that border to just pop into place, I don't think. I think it'd be nice if maybe we always had a border there. So why don't we start by just adding a border and see what it looks like. I'm going to go with a 2-pixel border so it's a little bit more obvious. And you can see by default it's a really light border. I think this is maybe a bit too high contrast compared to the background. This kind of looks like what I want the focus state to look like. So why don't we try and dull it down? Maybe we can try something like border gray 500, see what that looks like. Maybe even a little bit duller, maybe border gray 600. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Okay, so now for the focus styles, let's start by getting rid of that focus ring with focus outline none. And then maybe we'll add focus border white so that when we do focus the button, it's nice and bright. So you can see, yeah, now when I tab to the button, we get this nice bright white sort of focus ring that we've kind of done ourselves. And I think that looks a lot nicer while still being clear that that element has received focus. Okay, so now that we've got the sort of button and avatar styled, let's focus on the actual content. This obviously is no good. So let's head over to this div. We'll add a class attribute. I think, most commonly drop-downs are white. So why don't we give this a white background? And we probably don't want all of these links to be left to right. Normally in a drop-down, they're stacked. So why don't we accomplish that by just adding a class here and setting all of these to block. Now, what about the border radius? Right now it's square. Again, we've been using kind of a nice large border radius on most things in this UI so far. So why don't we go with rounded LG on this so that we get those nice rounded corners here as well. Okay, so now the thing that's sort of standing out to me is that things are a little bit cramped. We've sort of got all these elements butted right up against the edge. So there's a couple different ways we could tackle this, right? One would be to add some padding to this container, like P4 or something like that, right? Now, the thing that I don't like about this is, say we wanted to do like a hover style on this link where like the background changes color. By putting the padding on the parent element, we would only be able to highlight sort of like this area of the link. It wouldn't go all the way to the edges. So if we want like a hover highlight state to go all the way to the edges, we actually have to put the padding on each individual element instead of on the container. So I'm going to get rid of the padding here, and why don't we just add like some horizontal padding to each link to start. Maybe we'll do something like PX4, and let's add a little bit of vertical padding too. Let's start with like PY4 just to make it even. Now that's obviously way too much, so why don't we do something like PY2, and I think that's actually not too bad. Now the one thing that does look a little bit awkward about this to me is that we've got a lot more space between each link than we actually have sort of at the top and bottom of the drop down. So right now, like we've got 2 here and 2 here, and then 2 here and 2 here, which means in between here, we've got 4. So I think maybe a nice way to balance this out would be to add a little bit of extra top padding to this container. So why don't we try like PY2 here to sort of balance that out? And yeah, I think that actually looks pretty decent. Okay, next thing I want to look at is the hover state that we sort of talked about. Maybe we can get that going here. So I think to start, let's decide on a text color for these links, sort of a default text color. Right now, it's just using like whatever the default for the site is, but I think we can maybe go a little bit softer maybe. Maybe we can try like text gray 800. Yeah, so that's just like a tiny bit softer, but I think to me looks a little bit nicer. Now for our hover state, we want to change the background, right? So why don't we try something like BG? We'll use indigo since that's sort of the brand color that we've been using. And I'll start with 500 and just see what that sort of looks like. So you can see the background color changes. And you know what? I actually think that background color is pretty nice. But the text looks really stupid being dark like this. So let's make sure that we change the text color on hover as well. So I'm going to say hover text white. And now, yeah, now we got like some pretty nice looking links here. So some final details. I want to work on sort of the sizing and positioning of this drop-down container a little bit. So right now it just sort of like adapts to the size of the container. So it'll go like totally full width, which is probably not what we want. So I think we should maybe give this a specific width. Why don't we try something like maybe like W32, see what that looks like. That's a little bit too narrow, maybe like W48. Yeah, I think this is actually pretty good. Like, if we had some really long text here, we might want to make this wider, but for our use case and sort of the content that we're using, I think this is a pretty nice size. Now you can see that this dropdown is butted up right against this button, which I don't think looks great. I think it'd be nice if there was maybe a tiny bit of space in between there. So why don't we go ahead and try like MT1 here. That's not too bad. What about MT2? Is that too much? No, I think MT2 actually looks good too. So let's roll with MT2. Very last detail that I think I want to work on here is making this dropdown sort of appear like it's raised off the page. So right now it's just kind of like a container that's sort of flat against the background. It looks to be at like the same elevation as this image. Now a dropdown is usually supposed to look like it's sort of popping off the page a little bit, and we can accomplish that using a shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and take this padding utility. I'm going to move that over here because I kind of prefer when utilities that sort of affect the size and position of things are kind of at the beginning and stuff that's a little bit more decorative is at the end. And let's just add a shadow here. So maybe we'll just add like a regular shadow, see what that looks like. I can't really even see it on this dark background. Maybe we can go like shadow MD, see what that looks like. You can see it a little bit, still a little bit hard to see. I want to try something like really big, like Shadow XL. Yeah, I think it's probably going to be a little bit hard to see to you, but if you look at this in your own browser, that actually does give it this like nice sort of elevated effect. And if we really wanted to sort of see what it looked like on a lighter background, we could sort of drop the background down to like 300 here, and you can see, yeah, we got this nice shadow. So I'm going to stick with the dark background for now. But yeah, I think this looks pretty good. So in the next video, we're going to work on actually taking this drop down and sticking it in the nav bar that we designed earlier and making a few tweaks to make sure that things actually work the way that we want them to work.